Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I'm your host Sri Krishna, and my guest today is Aditya Dige, who works as an investment specialist in the telecom sector at Invest India. Aditya, welcome to All Things Policy.
Thank you so much, Sri, for having me here.
So today our discussion is going to be about the telecom sector in India, specifically with respect to the work that Aditya has been doing at Invest India. And before we get into that, just for the benefit of our viewers, I would like to, read out some statistics that I found on your website, which drive home the point of how important telecom sector is to our country and to its economy. So the telecom industry in India is the second largest in the world and has a subscriber base of 1.17 billion. And this includes both wireless and wireline subscribers. India has an overall tele density of 83.25%, of which rural density is a little lesser, which stands at 58.15%, and the urban density is around 129.88%. And as far as FDI, foreign direct investment, is concerned, telecom sector actually makes up for the third largest in terms of FDI inflows and contributes to around 6.4% of total FDI inflow. It also contributes to employment of nearly 4 million jobs in our country, which includes 2.2 direct employment and 1.8 million indirect employment. And finally, 100% FDI is today allowed in the telecom sector. So with this sort of background in mind, I would like to invite Aditya to sort of take us through what exactly Invest India has been doing in this sector. Before that, maybe you can also speak about Invest India in general as to what is your mandate, what is your role, and maybe you can touch upon how exactly telecom sector has benefited from the work that you're doing.
Absolutely. So thank you so much for this introduction, Sri. Just to begin with what Invest India is. So Invest India is the National Investment Promotion and Facilitation Agency, and we are housed within DPIIT, Ministry of Commerce. So now, one of our major mandates is to facilitate investments across different sectors and be a part of the Make in India mission that we have. So as part of that mission, we facilitate investments primarily by leveraging government policies and schemes in place. The organizations set up in a 3-tier structure where we have teams which directly deal with the embassies and diplomats of different countries. They try to source investments from those countries, and once we get a lead from there, the sector as well as the state teams come into picture. The sector team, by which I'm a part of, we essentially work towards creating our sectoral knowledge, and then we also leverage the union government schemes in that particular sector to help the investor in grounding their investments. And about the state teams, they essentially also look at the state policies that could be relevant wherever the investor wishes to ground their investment. So it's basically a holistic ecosystem which handholds investors right from the day they decide to invest in India. And after they have invested, we provide all sorts of issue resolution mechanisms that may involve the government stakeholders. So that's one part of our job, but as a sector team, I'll also give you a quick update. Back in 2020, the Union Cabinet approved the setting up of an empowered group of secretaries. And the empowered group of secretaries were to work with project development cells across different ministries. And one of the ministries was also the Telecom Ministry. Now, you may ask me what the role of a project development cell is. And that is to essentially create more investable opportunities within that sector. So the telecom sector also has a PDC to it, and Invest India works as the SPOC of that, which means the single point of contact for that PDC. We work very closely with senior bureaucrats in creating more investable opportunities in the sector. For example, recently we have worked on the reduction in compliance burden exercise, where we work very closely with industry participants. We work very closely with the government stakeholders in identifying compliances that could increase the operational efficiencies of not just the TSPs within the telecom sector, but also different players. For example, the telecom equipment manufacturers, the infrastructure providers. And by that time, we ended up identifying almost close to 25 plus compliances this year. that have been approved by the government. Some of them have also made their entry into the cabinet document on 5G spectrum auction, right? So that's the sort of scale we are talking about. As I was saying, that there are also additional projects that we have worked on. For instance, we have also helped DOT prepare a draft issue resolution mechanism for resolving investor queries that take investor queries within the telecom sector. One of the problems which investor used to face earlier was about not having a single point of contact with when interacting with the ministry, and knowing that there are just several departments, several individuals that can be contacted, it became very difficult for investors earlier to ground their investments. And to overcome that, we also pitched this idea to DOT and helped them prepare an SOP, which is now in place, where investors have been provided a turnaround time of almost 50 days for their issue resolution wherever DOT is involved. So these are some of the big scale, some of the big impact projects that we have undertaken as the telecom team at Invest India, and while working with the PDC. And apart from that, some part of our work also involves dealing directly with some investment roadshows, which involve senior ministers, which involve the PMO, and then we provide strategic inputs as to what could be the theme which could be pitched during these roadshows or investor outreach activities. So I would say these are the three pronged major roles that we play at Invest India.
No, that's great to hear because, whenever we hear of discussion about FDI, it's mostly that the government has opened up sector XYZ to say 49%, 75%, 100% FDI. And then we hear these statistics that, FDI, so many billions of rupees has come in this quarter, so many billions came in that quarter and whatnot. So thanks for taking us through the nitty gritties of how, at the back end, you guys are facilitating this FDI to actually enter the country and helping the investors make their fruitful investments in this country. I want to sort of like keep FDI aside for now and talk about the telecom sector in general, right? So, from whatever I gather, it has been an exciting time. The 5G rollout has begun. The auctions went very well before that. The government is also consolidating the age old telecom regulations. I think the Telegraph Act is being scrapped and a new bill has been brought in. So a lot of activities happening. But from the quick chat I had with you earlier, I also understand that a lot of these policy measures started a while ago. For example, with ELI, with Telecom Development Fund, and so on. And today, sort of, I wouldn't say culmination, but everything is coming together for the telecom industry. So would you take me through this process? Like, what are the policy measures that the government has taken in the recent years regarding the telecom sector?
Yeah, definitely, Shri. So I think the telecom bill is actually the culmination of all these smaller reforms that have taken place over the years. And now, while telecom bill is obviously something which is being worked upon by the ministry, they are taking comments from different stakeholders. I think it's also important, and it's more crucial that we also acknowledge the reforms that were brought in earlier, which has led to this stage today, right? So you very interestingly mentioned about PLI, and I think that was the turning point for telecom sector last year when it was brought in. And I'll just quickly explain what PLI was, when it was brought in. So it's the production linked incentive scheme for manufacturing of telecom and networking products in India. Now, why did we need this scheme to begin with? We needed this scheme because we realized that the supply side of telecom equipment manufacturing in India is extremely weak. We do not have, while there's certainly a lot of demand which is met by foreign vendors for the leading TSPs, we did not have the domestic capabilities to cater to that demand. And to overcome that, we brought in the concept of PLI, which sought to localize your supply chain, which sought to localize your manufacturing of telecom products in India. And that was extremely crucial because, the components of PLI, if you look at it, it provides fiscal incentives for companies to come and set up shops in India. And, as part of the PLI scheme, and I think it's drafted a little differently from the PLI schemes that you will see, which Mighty has come up with earlier. Please bear with me as I explain the fiscal incentives of PLI a little, right? So, as per the PLI, approved applicants have to make investments across a time period of 4 years. And in these 4 years, they can make these investments in different phases. Yearly investments can be divided across these 4 years. Now, the incentives under this scheme will be provided as a percentage of the net incremental sales that a company has, net incremental sales target that an approved company has to achieve. And what will be this target? This target will be a multiple of the investment that the company has made in that 1 year, right? So, this is how the fiscal incentive for PLI is structured. And the incentives will be provided over the years for 5 years from the day on which they were given their approval under the scheme. The interesting part about this scheme is also that it covers a large breadth of telecom products such as core transmission equipment, wireless equipment, enterprise equipment, and also it doesn't only cater to the larger companies. There's when the scheme had come out earlier, a significant chunk of it was earmarked for MSME companies as well. So I think that way, this scheme was the first step towards localizing, and a very much needed step towards localizing manufacturing in India, given our import dependencies. Now, as part of what all is covered under this scheme, just so you know, all the investment, which could also include your R&D expenses, infrastructural expenses, transfer of technology, all these aspects are covered under this scheme for getting fiscal incentives. Now, when this scheme had come up in 2021, a lot of investors came to India, set up assembly shops, and then started manufacturing products. However, it was interesting to note that the assembly lines, with some of the investors, where they were just importing a significant chunk of the components in that end product, and then they were just assembling the final product on that assembly line, and then availing incentives under the scheme. While there was nothing wrong with that, because we did not have any assembly lines to begin with, DOT also realized that we need to go a step back in the value chain and also incentivize designing of the telecom product. And that's when in June 2022, as a step ahead of PLI, we came up with the design led manufacturing amendments to PLI, where the government has now provided additional incentives to manufacturers who will also design their product here, and then they will also assemble the product here and eventually manufacture it completely, right? So that additional incentive that the government has provided has met with a stellar response, as we'll also see that almost close to 42 companies are now approved under the design led manufacturing. The results came out last week, and there are some significant policy changes as well, right? For example, from the definition of investments which are eligible to be getting an incentive on, in that definition, R&D cap, there is no R&D cap anymore. Earlier there used to be a cap on the expenses of on the R&D expenses on which the incentive could be taken, but that's not there anymore. Similarly, manpower expenses, which form a large chunk of R&D expenses, they too have been brought within the ambit of the scheme. So that way, the scheme has trying to cater to the ecosystem of manufacturing in India, and which is very important at this stage. And now going a step behind the designing part as well, right? What comes before that? And to answer that question, the government recently in October came up with the Telecom Technology Development Fund. So it's a fund which will be funded by the Universal Service Obligation Fund, which has been set up by DOT for providing connectivity to rural areas in India, right? So a part of that, 5% of that fund, I think that's the maximum cap that can also be used for the Telecom Technology Development Fund, which will focus on providing funding to companies which engage in R&D for products which could be useful for rural specific communication technology. And the funding will again also not just be for R&D purposes, but it will also be milestone based, where it's needed to show that a prototype of a product has been achieved. So that way, the entire manufacturing ecosystem has undergone a tremendous change, and tremendous policy support has been provided to it. And in the coming few years, we'll also see the impact of that in terms of how fast the network is deployed by TSPs. So I would say the government has definitely brought in much needed reforms here.
That's fantastic to hear. And I think the primary takeaway here is, you cannot just focus at the end product. You have to also look at the allied sectors. You have to make sure that they are rightly incentivized and they are rightly sort of placed to supply to the domestic manufacturers. And also the fact that, and this is something I want to pick up later on after this short break I'm just about to take, but the fact that this becomes all the more important with 5G and telecom equipment, because there we have a security challenge coming from our neighborhood. We'll pause for a short break here and we'll come back on All Things Policy with Aditya. Welcome back to All Things Policy. We are in conversation with Aditya Dige about the telecom industry in our country. So, like I mentioned earlier, we will talk about 5G going ahead for the next few minutes or so. And the major issue about 5G worldwide has been about security. The security challenge, which most countries fear, coming from Huawei and ZTE and some of the other Chinese companies, which have an edge when it comes to the back end telecom infrastructure equipment. And most countries are going out of their way to avoid that, because they fear that allowing these Chinese entities, some of which have very close relations with the Chinese state, is not desirable, because telecom is a crucial strategic sector in any economy. So, in this backdrop, Aditya, I wanted to ask you that, given that 5G has seen a lot of geopolitical contestation, what has the Indian government done about it? I understand that you have worked closely in this issue. So, would you like to take us through that?
Sure, Shri. So I think I would not say that the Indian government has taken steps only to cater to the geopolitical contestation that you just spoke about. But I think it's also about inculcating best practices within the telecom sector. And as part of that, the Indian government has brought in reforms like the MTCT regime, which requires the mandatory testing of telecom equipment against certain testing verticals, right? They could include your technical verticals, they could include your safety, EMI, EMC, and security requirements. So, as part of the MTCT regime, the government has issued the TEC wing of DOT, which is the Telecom Engineering Center, that has issued certain essential requirements across all different types of telecom products. And every manufacturer has to comply with those essential requirements, get it tested by a conformity assessment body, which is another testing lab which is accredited by TEC. And the idea is that once a product has been tested against the essential requirements issued, then that product is fit to be sold in the market. So that's the MTCT regime which the government has brought in, and with very noble intentions, I must say, because network, with increasing softwareization of network, with the increasing edge networking, we need products which are compliant with which are benchmarked against certain qualitative standards. So the intention of the government here has not been incorrect at all. Rather, it's a positive step. However, there have been a few issues in terms of how MTCT also has been implemented, right? While in my experience, I've spoken to several telecom manufacturers, and they agree that MTCT is a regime which should be there. There should be a quality control on the products that are launched in the market. However, there have been problems around the number of testing labs which are available in the country currently for advanced technologies, especially for the sunrise technologies like 5G, AI, IoT related aspects, and even the core network components. Unfortunately, the existing ecosystem of testing labs takes a lot of time for testing these products. And I think that's where the government is now also pushing to increase the number of conformity assessment bodies, because the more the delay is there in testing of these products, the more the difficulty would be in operationalizing 5G at the speed that everyone has envisaged for it, right? Just to give you an example, phase 3 and phase 4 of MTCT has been extended since January 2022, right? And even the extensions have been provided till June or July 2023. The reason primarily being that we don't have the infrastructure currently to test these products at the speed that is required. And that's something which the government is also working towards. But I think there also need, while we have given exemptions on testing of products under phase 3 and phase 4, I think it's also important to strike a balance between maintaining that quality control as well as expediting the operationalizing of a network. And I think that balance is something which I hope the government will soon be addressing, because the testing labs currently, several of them, lack the testing equipment which is required for advanced technologies. And a large factor behind that is the capex and the opex which is involved in getting that testing equipment in place. On top of that, you also don't have enough skilled workers or enough skilled professionals who could test the products that manufacturers bring in. So, to basically address these issues, I think the government has also acknowledged, and I think they would also be working towards bringing in. I hope that they work towards bringing in a fiscal incentive policies for basically setting up of a testing lab, so that the quality control, the essential requirements are also adhered to in the future while we continue to deploy the network infrastructure at a rapid pace.
That's right. I think it's actually illuminating to understand how difficult this whole process is, right? When we say that, oh, we need to keep certain equipments from certain countries out of our network infrastructure, but how do you actually operationalize that on the ground? I think that's where the real challenge is, and it adds to business costs, it delays 5G rollout, and it's very easy to suggest that we have to ensure that there is no Chinese infrastructure, but working on that in the ground, I see it from a completely different perspective now. Other issue with 5G has also been about fiberization, right? 5G towers, if I understand correctly, need to be fiberized, and the percentage of fiberization in India is quite low, and this could actually be a potential challenge to quick 5G rollout. So what are your views on this?
Sure, Shri. So, just to give you the scale of digital inclusivity that we have in India, I'll give you a quick fact that the rural population that's connected to internet today is only 37%, right? The rural areas are extremely underpenetrated when it comes to internet connectivity. And while 5G will certainly grow in urban areas, because there's a lot of street infrastructure you will require, there will be small cells, TSPs will invest in the infrastructure, because there's the density which will also somehow, it will cater to the capex that TSPs will be putting in, right? They will get returns on the investment that they make in urban areas. But the real challenge lies in the rural areas of the country, and that's where we haven't been able to make much progress. Even under the national broadband plan, under which BharatNet was also being implemented, it was envisaged that 70% of the country would be fiberized by 2025. However, as of date, only 35% fiberization has taken place in the country. And more than almost 35 lakh kilometers of fiber needs to be deployed between in the next 2 years to essentially reach our target. So, looking at the scale of the lack of fiberization that we have, I think there have been multiple policy issues that have been brought in by infrastructure providers, and one of them has been about sharing of optical, basically fiber infrastructure between different telecom service providers. Currently, each TSP sets up its own fiber infrastructure, and that again, I mean, that requires a tremendous amount of money. And that will also take me to my, next point about what advanced technologies can be brought in to address that issue. But with fiber, there are, just the scale of investment that's required. It's important that we soon bring in reforms. And I'm sure the government's also aware of that, and they would be working along on those lines.
Yeah, so since you mentioned the problem of lack of infrastructure, especially in rural and remote areas, one of the solutions which has been in the news for quite some time now is about using direct satellite based internet services, right? And I think with Starlink, which is promoted by Elon Musk, this has also been operationalized to some extent. And we have also read reports about how, he offered the service in Ukraine, and a lot of people were
Yeah.
benefited in a situation like that. So, what has been India's brush with SATCOM options? Do you see that as a potential alternative in the coming future?
Yeah. So, Shri, I think SATCOM as a topic in India has been much discussed about, and we are yet to find a solution. There's been knowledge sharing around SATCOM since 2015, 2016. I think by around the time when Jio had entered into the market, and everyone recognizes the potential of SATCOM. and in just bringing in digital inclusivity in a country like India, where the digital divide is humongous as of date, with almost close to 63% of the population, rural population, which requires internet connectivity. Satcom is a solution which has been touted by a lot of industry commentators. And, just to give you some context about why everyone's talking about Satcom, I'll give you. So there was this study which was done by, there's a report which was released by ORF, I think a few years ago, and that had this one figure which caught my eye. Now, to provide fiber connectivity to 1 square kilometer of an area could require a capex somewhere anywhere between $3,000 to $30,000, right? Whereas if you use satellite connectivity for providing internet for a similar area, the expenses, the capex required would come down to 1.5 to $1.6. So given the
That's
stark
a
difference,
that's a stark difference. Yeah.
yeah, that's a stark difference, right? And no wonder companies across the globe, it's not, while we have heard mostly about Starlink, but there are several global players who are willing to come into the Indian market. They are just waiting and watching about the regulatory, the gray area in our regulatory sphere today on satellite communication. You spoke about Starlink. There are also companies like Mr. Bharti backed OneWeb. There's Telesat, where Tata is also involved. I think Amazon also has one of the companies in this space, and they're also looking at it, right? So there are multiple global players who are waiting to see where our regulatory policy is headed. And just to shed some light on the regulatory confusion that we have, I'll tell you. So the first prong of the confusion is which telecom license to go for. I think we currently have a unified license regime in India under which you have different authorizations for different types of telecom services that one wants to provide. For the longest of times, there was a confusion about which, because we do not have any specific license which caters to commercialization of satellite connectivity, right? However, now a lot of, unfortunately, we haven't had any regulatory change to cater to that too. But currently, several of the players have started going for the GMPCS authorization under the unified license, along with long distance authorization under NLD ILD regime. Right. So that's one, for example. Some companies have managed to get their authorizations in place. But once you get that authorization in place, the next difficulty is about the spectrum usage. Now in India, the spectrum band for satellite connectivity, there is still no regulatory decision has been made on that as to whether that spectrum should be auctioned or whether that should be administratively allocated. We have industrialists on both sides of the debate. For example, Reliance Jio as well as Vodafone have contested that this spectrum for satellite connectivity also needs to be auctioned, whereas OneWeb has constantly made a point that it should be administratively allocated. So I think there is confusion, there is regulatory uncertainty about the spectrum usage that needs to be dealt with by DOT. But moving beyond that, the entire space of SATCOM is not only dealt with by DOT, it's also dealt with by the Department of Space, which has been working on preparing draft space policy. They had released this draft back in 2020, but we are yet to see a final space policy that will also set out the semantics of how satellite services or how satellite launches by private operators will take place. So, in this whole in this whole space of uncertainty, I believe that this technology has significant potential, but to leverage that, we now, and to also bridge the digital divide in India, we certainly need to fasten the process of bringing in reforms for specifically to this subsector.
Yeah, thanks for that explanation, Aditya. So the way I see it, there exists regulatory logjam, and it's also a question of territoriality, I suppose, between different ministries of the union government. And but for the time constraints, I would have loved to chat more on this. But I place my hope in the fact that we'll soon have the final iteration of the telecom bill, and also probably we'll see a space legislation coming in very soon. So with that, I would like to let you off with a quick question at the end. So Aditya, our PM has already spoken about India becoming a leader in 6G, forget 5G. And I personally feel that's a very optimistic and ambitious goal to set. So where do you stand on this? What do you think?
So, Shri, I certainly agree with the PM's vision on 6G. We, being a country with immense talent, we certainly should be taking a lead on the 6G innovation race. And for that also, our government has taken head start on that front too. So just so you know, a 6G Technology Innovation Group has been established by DOT with the objective to, create a 6G technology ecosystem where we have increased participation in capability description standards development at the with international standard setting bodies. So I am certainly looking forward to the contribution of this group at an international scale, and I can only hope that it helps India in becoming a leader in the 6G space.
Yeah, thanks for that. And especially, I think the point you made about international standard setting is very relevant because India has always been lagging when it comes to, standards setting at an international level. So hopefully we will see positive results in the near future. But of course, I'm sure our listeners are also looking forward to 5G first and 6G later. Anyway, thanks a lot, Aditya, for joining me on this chat today. Thanks a lot for appearing on All Things Policy, and we really hope that you're a regular.
Thank you so much, Sri, for having me here.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcasts app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is at IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takstashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.